today's World Insight, after the Republican-led House elected Kevin McCarthy the Speaker, what does the debacle before getting there mean for U.S. governance? And how could it affect America's foreign policy?
Hello, and welcome to World Insight with me, Tian Wei. We begin today's program with an eye on U.S. politics. Republican Congressman Kevin McCarthy did clinch the U.S. House speakership on Saturday after making big concessions to the last holdouts. McCarthy won at last on a margin of 216 to 212 on the 15th ballot, the most round of voters for House Speaker in over 160 years. But many warn his concession could backfire, the House falling short in preventing U.S. federal shutdown over the past decade. Republican opposition to raising the U.S. debt ceiling has also pushed the world's largest borrower to brink of default in efforts to extract steep spending cuts. So what do U.S. House Speaker McCarthy's leadership concession really mean for American governance? How to understand the depths of the Washington political divide? And how would that affect U.S. conduct in world affairs? Let's loop in our panelists. I'm glad to be joined by Rina Shah, a political analyst, and also Bruce Fain, constitutional lawyer, former Associate Deputy Attorney General in the Federal Communication Commission under President Reagan, certainly earlier related to the Republican Party. Great to see both of you on the final result of the House Speaker election. Finally, there's a name, and finally it's confirmed. Rina, how do you see this prolonged process?
Well, now that we finally have a functioning U.S. House of Representatives, it's time to see what the Republican Party can do with this narrow majority that they hold. Certainly, the midterms did not turn out in a way that Republicans had hoped. And I was certainly one of those strategists that even getting to this week, I thought maybe McCarthy didn't have it in the bag, so to speak, but it would maybe be 2 to 3 ballots. Nobody, not even the most seasoned political strategist, could have seen this happening. I find it fascinating that not since the Civil War have we had this many ballots to get to a House Speaker, the person who is essentially third in line with running the country. And so this is a situation where it's not just disappointing to see what happened this past week. It was a frustrating and bitter process that I think is going to have a heavy weight on the hearts of many of the people serving within that chamber. And it leaves many of us wondering, will this Speaker McCarthy even last the full 2 years?
It really wasn't until Newt Gingrich was elected in 1994 that the Speaker basically became, the king of the Congress. Dominated who sat on committees, what bills got to the floor, how they would be debated. And I think that the debate and the concessions that Kevin McCarthy was forced to make to devolve power back to the committees is going to make it a much more representative institution than before. It may mean that we still have gridlock because there are obviously substantive disputes, not only within Republicans in the House, but also between Republicans in the Senate, led by Mitch McConnell and Kevin McCarthy himself. But that's what democracy is about. Deliberation. All right. Don't have the votes, nothing happens for that period of time.
Well, democracy is not about chaos, but who am I to judge? It's your politics. But one would want to come back to you, Rina, since you're both based in the U.S., your thoughts about what Bruce just said.
I think it's one of those moments where you had to look at these 20 people and say, who's in it for the country and who's in it for themselves? Now, at the very end, on the 15th ballot, we had some 6 final holdouts and they voted present. And that's how McCarthy became Speaker at the end of the day. What do those 6 people mean? Democrats have said this very small group of Republicans were holding our government hostage. And I do agree on many points with people who say democracy is messy. But what we have here in our representative democracy is this ability to talk about our values. And I heard very little of that this past week. I heard a lot of, again, talk about doing investigations and less talk about passing legislation. That is something I wanted to see more of from Republicans going into this week. Instead, what we saw was dysfunction. We saw people who couldn't govern themselves. So how can they govern and lead the country from the people's house? That was one really big sentiment that I walked away with after even this was all said and done.
There are a lot of expectations about a new Congress under various leadership of both political parties. To you, Rena, what do you think are some of the priorities now, finally the dust is settled, the Congress should work on?
I do believe the Biden administration can walk and chew gum, but Republicans would be good to propose some alternatives in terms of really tackling inflation and alternatives to what the Democrats did legislatively last year and what the Biden administration is doing and not doing right now. So that's on the economic front. But in terms of immigration, everybody can agree the border crisis at our southern border is something that I want to see more bipartisanship on. But I do think cybersecurity and technological innovations could also help us in that area. And somebody should also, from the Republican Party, talk about visa overstays. That is a huge issue here as well. And thirdly, energy, because of what's happening with the Russian invasion into the Ukraine. I do think that has made energy a hot topic from last year into this year. And Republicans can again lead if they talk about what their ideas and solutions are for American energy independence.
Talking about one of the issues you just touched on, immigration, for example, at the southern border of the U.S., we see the U.S. president is going to Mexico for a rare trip. And now he's also announcing some possibilities of decisions related to immigration, actually quite similar to what the previous administration, for example, under Trump would do, suggesting that those who are seeking political asylum, likely at the southern border. Now that makes a lot of people wonder whether the two political parties are really that different after the midterm election, once one administration secures a second term.
One of the greatest frustrations I've seen amongst younger Republicans is that there's just nobody talking about responsible solutions to really confronting the problem of these people arriving at our border and then making their way into American cities and states and then staying here. How do we as a country not have open borders, but still extend this almost unofficial policy we've had for decades of accepting those people that are legitimately seeking asylum? I myself am the daughter of two immigrants who came over in 1970 and 1980, and I take great issue with anybody that jumps the line. But I just don't see who's going to lead the conversation in a responsible way. Maybe there will be somebody like a Senator Ted Cruz in the Senate who will say, now's the time, let's start the discussion. Again, he's a senator from Texas. So it could be a conversation that is shepherded by Republicans, but I just don't see any leadership from anyone in Congress right now. So let's see what Biden does after this next week.
Now, Bruce, tell me more about your thoughts of how McCarthy could be establishing the respect from the others once he is in the job. Does he have a solution?
Now, with regard to Mr. McCarthy, he has a very weak leader. It's not because of any necessary divisions. He doesn't have very strong principles, which came forth even with regard to his attitude on January 6th. One day he was saying, I talked to Trump, I said, you got to do things here. This is ridiculous. It's terrible. The next day he's down to Mar-a-Lago, pleading with Trump to get him back in his good graces. He's like a human weather vane, and he will be a weak leader for that reason, that he doesn't, because he has never demonstrated a commitment to principles. Look at anything he's written, have a clear program in his mind other than just staying in power. I think that we'll see a lot of internal maneuvering in the Republican Party. It may not get out of the House, but it's not a disaster. If they can't reach a consensus, it's more important that we have procedures and we have full and fair debate on all these issues rather than what happens regularly if we keep to the status quo. A 4,000-page bill put on the member's desk and say, vote on it in 24 hours. They can't even read a half page of that document before they have to vote on it. That is not democracy.
What does it mean if leaders' sole goal of conducting leadership is to remain in the leadership rather than the end goal of leadership, which is to create service for the people. Of course, it's debatable as to what the service should be about, how they should be conducted, but how do you see this very interesting question, Rena?
So there were certain concessions that Speaker McCarthy had to make in order to get the speakership. Some of those were, of course, leaked to the press, told to them, and some of us came to know while everything was going on and he hadn't yet locked up the speakership. But some of these concessions, we don't fully know what they are, and it'll take weeks for us to find out. Promises of committee assignments, we'll find out fairly soon, of course. But some of these were done with a handshake. And one big word that I really saw come up over and over in the negotiations between, again, these holdouts and who they call the establishment, which is Speaker McCarthy and his ilk, was the word trust. Trust was really broken down between him and his caucus. And it really does lead one to think that, again, as a weakened speaker, he just is not going to be able to get much done. He kept the extremists at bay until he couldn't anymore.
Now, what do you think, Bruce, about the discussion regarding the quality of leadership and what leadership should be about? And when one's having the leadership, what he or she should do?
I think that the reason why I think so much of Washington is dysfunctional is because leaders perceive themselves as there not to solve problems, make the country better for the people. It's to remain in power and to keep problems festering if it will keep their base intact. That is, it seems counterintuitive, but the leaders don't want to solve the problem. That's why you see immigration has been around for 50 years. It comes back the same time. The Democrats say, we don't want to solve it because we think we get votes by claiming that the Republicans are harsh and cruel. The Republicans don't want to solve it because they want votes that are, many of them are xenophobic, but not all of them. People who feel that the immigrants somehow are going to contaminate, the great white race or something. And so both sides, they sit there and they make mottos and nothing happens. There's been no change in immigration law of any sort really since 1986, when I was there, when the Immigration Reform Act was passed under President Reagan. But that's what, almost 40 years ago. So that's where leadership is lacking. They clearly are putting their own partisan interests ahead of the interests of the American people. How do you change that? It really is up to the voters to be able to detect that kind of what I would call narcissism, egotism, and say, we're not voting for you. Most of them, however, unfortunately, they don't live in Washington. They really can't conceive that the politicians on both sides get together and say, let's not solve the problem so I can get my base and you can have your base and we'll both get to return time after time and nothing gets solved, but we stay in power.
You're watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. Joining me, we have Rena and Bruce talking about the latest election of the House Speaker of the U.S. Congress. So, Rena, what do you say? How do you see McCarthy's track record and his rhetorics leading up to his House Speaker role about U.S. role in the world and about U.S. foreign policy?
Well, I think McCarthy becoming Speaker really emphasizes one kind of ugly point about our system over here. And it's that we do have an incentive structure that keeps this kind of power in place, that really keeps our incumbents coming back at a great advantage. And maybe this is a moment where more of our electorate will wake up and say, we need to change things here so that our standing on the world stage remains as great as I think it's always been. Surely this past week was a once in a century embarrassment for Republicans, actually, in my opinion. I mean, and that of many others. But it was also embarrassment for our country in many ways. We looked dysfunctional on the world stage. But I'm a forever optimist, or I couldn't have worked in politics this long. I think somebody like McCarthy will do the job, and he may not do it well, but he'll do it well enough and he'll get by. But the question is, his concessions, what he's done with these has made it incredibly hard for him to be effective and maybe even stay in the job the full 2 years. So And when we talk about what could happen from his perch in the House of Representatives, it was said earlier in this that it really takes the Senate, led by Democrats, to join hands with the other chamber to get anything done for the American people. Now, what our priorities are at this point, it certainly is about how we put the U.S. back on track for growth. Certainly, China has indicated it's focused on growth. What are we doing over here right now when inflation is still making it very difficult for us, the daily lives of the average American, for us to go out there and even put a good meal on our tables for our families? That is a tough moment. So I don't know from where Republicans in the House chamber will start to lead. I really don't even know where the Senate Democrats will begin, because I think this past week was such a shock to sort of everyone. I can't put that more eloquently. I think there are just people who are reeling from the fact that it actually happened. Nobody really thought that it would be this dysfunctional and it would play out in such a way where all the tensions that usually bubble beneath the surface and never get seen by the electorate writ large would be seen. And so how do we sort of recuperate from that and get serious about our standing and in terms of defending democracy the world over, particularly in places like Ukraine and with our NATO allies? I think it's a question that is open-ended right now, and there's just no good answer. But I certainly hope that they'll start by looking internally, because we can't fix anything externally if we don't get our own house in order.
A couple of observations. One, the Speaker doesn't make the foreign policy. The Congress or the House does.
But it could be quite an interesting figure.
When I was around, the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee at that time, the Senator William Fulbright, he had a lot more to do with the Vietnam War than the Senate Majority Leader at the time. But putting that aside, I do take issue with the idea that the 5 days it took to elect McCarthy was a disaster. I believe that we actually were a model to how democracy should function. People were respectful. They had their opportunity to have their say. It was fully diverse. You had Asians, you had Blacks, you had all sorts of different viewpoints represented. One person whose name was thrown into the mix was a Black American who had been the first Black House Speaker ever. There weren't any fisticuffs. There weren't any resort to violence. This is how free countries are supposed to operate. Nobody was punished because of their viewpoint. I would love it if other countries would follow this example in the way their own legislative bodies operated as well. It wasn't simply an echo chamber of the President of the United States. The vast majority of legislatures are simply rubber stamps who are only in the executive branch. That wasn't true here. Now, going to the larger issue of foreign policy, here is where, in the largest sense, the Republicans and Democrats agree. I don't agree with them, but they both vote for $1 trillion defense, national security budgets. Everyone, and I hate to say this on this program, thinks that China is the boogeyman. And they want to go into Taiwan, sell more weapons, put more sanctions on China, don't give them any technology that has dual use. And that is virtually without any dissent whatsoever. It's really frightening to me because I can see every day ratcheting up the tensions over Taiwan, the South China Sea. But unfortunately, there isn't any debate on that score. The foreign policy isn't going to change a whit from Trump to Biden. If anything, Biden has been more belligerent than Trump about China. And I believe that this is because we have cast ourselves as empire, that our greatness is viewed as controlling the entire world, even 6,000 miles away sea lanes, instead of acknowledging, well, other countries have spheres of influence like we have had 200 years in the Caribbean and South America. It may not be perfect, but it's a lot better than war.
Now, earlier with the House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, there was such a drama when she made up her decision, made up her mind, and went all her way to Taiwan. It created such a political stir and turmoil between China and the United States, as she was the third person in rank and file in the U.S. politics. Now, we also heard rhetoric coming from Mr. McCarthy when he was running for the House Speaker's role. Now, how much do you see the China card will be used politically by the House Speaker, despite of the latest closer to failure, shall we put it that way, politically? Rena.
Well, I certainly think talk of China during the Trump campaign was red meat for the base. He evoked China so much that at some point I had to wonder, well, this is sort of rather nonsensical, because it's not as if he came out of the gate with some sort of strong policy proposals about how we can really stand up and figure out how we stand against China, right? But there was always talk of that. And that frustrated me because I just never saw results coming out from the Trump administration in that way. And that's a sort of broad blanket statement. And just to say, I don't think Trump really saw the issue well. And I don't know that Biden's doing anything any differently. This is a moment where I don't know that Kevin McCarthy will even do anything differently. As Mr. Fine pointed out, how much can he do, again, because what's in his power? But the talk of China, when certainly he's out in Republican donor circles, I know he'll talk about it because it's something that certainly wakes up the establishment Republicans and say, we've got to find a way to compete with China. We've got to do better than China. We've got to also have a pro-growth mindset like China. And so how do we do that? By getting manufacturing going. But this has been the talk for decades. I mean, I served as a senior aide in Congress almost 15 years ago. And I'll tell you, this is the same exact talk. So my frustration is this, is that we don't have many systems reforms that, really make it easy for these people, such as Speaker McCarthy and other leaders in Congress, to come to the American public and directly speak to us about what their thoughts are about how we compete with other nations that are, again, ramping up towards being more prosperous than us. I hear the usual campaign talk when it's time for them to run, but when they're legislating and they're busy legislating, I just don't hear a real directness. And so that is where I would leave that.
And also the direction of running. I mean, it's not just about running, but also the direction of running. Look at what the Trump administration did with the trade tariffs, and they remained during the Biden administration. It's hurting American consumers, particularly with the layered inflation. By the way, the agricultural sector of the U.S. is hurting so much as a result of the tariffs. And it's just an open secret for everyone, but there's not much change. The CHIP Act claimed to be successful, but it's certainly disrupting the global supply chains. And not sure necessarily it's going to make America safer at this point. So it's from a different perspective, it's very interesting what the politicians promised and the ways they try to implement their promises, shaped in a way as if they are right for everyone. But actually, the result might be very different. Well, it's just my personal opinion. As a TV host, I wouldn't, just too much exploring my personal opinion, but rather I want to go to Bruce about your thoughts on how much more political danger or less does this mean for Mr. McCarthy's extreme choice of foreign policy possibilities, as long as his political leadership could touch on?
Well, I don't think that Mr. McCarthy's views are extreme, unfortunately. They're mainstream. President Biden, at least 4 times, has gratuitously said, if China attacks Taiwan, I am going to attack China, despite the fact that he voted for the Taiwan Relations Act in 1979 that says Congress will decide how to respond.
Do you see the danger he might use the China card safely in order to boost his popularity? As what you said, everybody seems to be apparently on the same page.
Yeah, absolutely, Dave. And that's why we are inching. I don't think it's what it was 20 years ago. We are doing in your face. The Pelosi visit was totally gratuitous. She didn't need to go there. It was just like trying to humiliate China. It had no national security purpose whatsoever. Declaring that the Uyghurs are victims of genocide. There's never been a trial. Declaring that Hong Kong needs to be made free. Well, that's a domestic affair of China. I'm not applauding everything there, but other countries get to decide their own fate. Forgetting that the British stole Hong Kong for a 99-year lease before giving it back. And you know how they did it? By an opium war, forcing drugs on the Chinese unwillingly. Then they flipped and then they want to be the anti-drug country. So these are the things that have escalated the tension. It's always been there to some degree. And I do believe that McCarthy, and not only McCarthy, but others also believe that they will prosper. And I don't want to leave out the $1 trillion military industrial complex. They love sending the new weapons to Taiwan. All the profits, they're huge. And the military industrial complex here in the United States is a huge contributor to these people. And they say, well, we're going to have all these jobs in your district because we're going to build these planes or submarines or whatever there, and you'll be very prosperous. Say, okay, then we're in favor of whatever you want to do in terms of weaponizing Taiwan.
How do you see the implications of U.S. politics overseas and also the models and practices that the U.S. could set for the others?
I do think that despite the fact that it may have looked awkward for many to take 5 days to elect a House Speaker, and the House, under its rules, couldn't move forward until the Speaker is elected, that despite that, the members and the participants acted with decorum. They acted with discretion. They didn't use vulgarities, call people names. They didn't resort to fisticuffs, although there were tensions that were high. And that's how the process is supposed to work. And on that score, I think that was a plus as sending an example to others. It's also important to remember that not all, but most of those who championed the January 6th insurrection lost in their efforts to win elections in 2022. And that is a very healthy sign.
Rena, final points before we go from you.
Yeah, I am concerned about January 6th moving forward because the Select Committee in the House has concluded its work. And that was in the previous Congress. Of course, Republicans are not going to let that Select Committee stand. So they issued their report. And now it is up to the Department of Justice. But I do think that the topic of political extremism is something that needs to be addressed by leaders sitting at our highest perches. This is really a moment where, we could see both Democrats and Republicans come together. I don't have much hope that that's going to happen anytime soon because Democrats held a memorial sort of moment of silence. They convened this past week and only one Republican joined them. That doesn't really augur well for the future of our democracy when both sides aren't coming together to mark something that should have been a moment that was again united. So I certainly am hopeful for our country, but there's a lot that needs to happen in order for our Americans to again know our process and understand it and not engage in vigilante justice, as it was said earlier, and become political extremists when they don't like the outcome of things.
Rena Shah, Bruce Fain, thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate it. That's all the time we have for today. If you'd like to know more, you can search website or check out our YouTube channel. Follow us on Twitter and Facebook. I'm Tian Wei. On behalf of the team, thanks for being with us. Bye for now.